In this video, we're going to look at a growing pattern. Here's a pattern of squares. We have step 1, step 2, and step 3. The first question is the number of small squares growing linearly? Explain how you know. So if it was linear growth, then the number of squares would be increasing at a consistent rate. Or in other words, it would increase by the same number of squares each time. So the question is that happening? So as I go from step 1 to step 2, I see that I'm going from 3 to 6 squares. So I'm adding 3 squares. As I go from step 2 to step 3, I'm going from 6 squares to 11 squares. So I'm adding 5 squares. So the answer is no, it is not linear because it is not increasing by the same number of squares each time. Question 2 says to complete the table. So we can easily count the squares to get the number of small squares for steps 1, 2, and 3. Step 1 is 3 squares. Step 2 is 6. And step 3 is 11. But to find the number of small squares in shapes where we don't have the picture, we have to look for the patterns in the shapes. Now what I want you to see here is that the way that these diagrams are made is that there's a square in the middle, and that square has a side length that is the same as the step number. So this first one has a side length of 1, the second step has a square with a side length of 2, and the third one has a square with a side length of 3. Then what you're doing is you're adding these two small squares in the corners at the bottom. So for step 4, what we would have is a 4 by 4 square, and then we would have 2 squares on either end. So this would be a 4 by 4 square, which would have a total of 16 small squares, plus 2 more small squares would give me a total of 18 small squares. Step 5 would have a 5 by 5 square in the middle, which is 25 small squares, plus another 2 small squares, so that would be a total of 27. Step 10 would have a 10 by 10 square in the middle, 100 small squares, plus the 2 on the ends would be 102. And step 12 would have a 12 by 12 square, which is 144 squares, plus 2 would give me 146. Now, for n, we're going to look at what the pattern is here. First, what we're doing is we're taking the step number and we are multiplying it by itself. Or in other words, we're squaring it. So I could write n times n if I wanted to, or a more convenient way that we have to write that is n squared. Then I'm adding 2 additional squares to that. So my number of small squares at step n is going to be n squared plus 2.